Montana Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you for joining this webinar to review the Montana Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Deployment Plan. This will be an update on the plan and a listening session for us to take your questions and comments. We're co-hosting this webinar with Department of Transportation, and we will be recording the webinar. As I noted, during this webinar, we'll be providing updates on Montana's management of the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI program, and walking through planned updates to the deployment plan. Following the presentations, we'll invite your comments and questions. You're automatically muted at this time and will remain muted unless called on to speak to provide a comment or ask a question. You may also type those questions you might have into the Q&A box, and we will address those questions. There's already one in there at the end of the webinar. If you're on the phone today with us, you'll be able to mute or unmute yourself by pressing *6 and press *9 to raise your hand. Joining me today to provide some opening remarks from the Montana Department of Transportation is Rob Stapley, Division Administrator for MDT's Rail, Transit, and Planning Division. Bear with us for just a second to make sure we've got Rob live. There he is. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Ben. I appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of MDT and our partners at DEQ, I just want to say thank you for your interest and for taking the time to join us today to learn more about Montana's EV deployment plan. Through reauthorization of the Federal Transportation Bill, the state is the lucky recipient of NEVI federal funding. Over the 5-year bill, MDT is scheduled to receive nearly $43 million to fund EV charging infrastructure along alternative fuel corridors. These are federal funds, meaning there are strings attached to them. MDT's role will be to administer these funds in a way that will meet all federal requirements. DEQ will be developing a program to prioritize locations for chargers. We do not anticipate the stations to be in MDT's right-of-way, as federal statute prohibits the installation in interstate right-of-way. Tourism plays a big role in Montana's economy, and we can anticipate that tourists coming to our state will be driving EVs in increasing numbers. This plan outlines how the state will prioritize EV charging infrastructure to support the national network. Thanks again, and we welcome your feedback and input on the plan as we move forward implementing the NEVI program.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate those comments. DEQ has been coordinating closely on EV planning and infrastructure development with MDT for more than 6 years and appreciates the partnership we've built with the Department of Transportation. Our primary role at this stage in the NEVI program is drafting annual updates to the deployment plan, and our work on EV planning is led by 2 of the state's experts on alternative fuels and electric vehicle infrastructure, Neil Oman, who you'll be hearing from today, and Kyla Mackey, who's the supervisor of our energy planning section in the Energy Bureau. We look forward to sharing our updates on EV infrastructure and this plan, and hearing your comments and suggestions. Next up is Ben Murphy. He's an electric vehicles planner in the Integrated Transportation and Publications section at MDT. Ben, go ahead.
Thanks, Ben. So I'm just going to give you all a little bit of background on the NEVI program, just to set the scene a little bit. So this was established through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, which is also referred to as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And this was passed in November of 2021. The bill includes $7.5 billion for EV charging stations. $5 billion of this is for the NEVI formula program, and $2.5 billion is set aside for the discretionary community and corridor grant planning. Today, we're just going to be focusing on the NEVI formula program. We're not going to discuss the community or corridor grant program. NEVI does require a 20% non-federal match, and we anticipate that the non-federal match will come from private entities. The purpose of this program is to support a convenient, affordable, reliable, and equitable EV charging network. And these funds are eligible on FHWA designated alternative fuel corridors, which we will touch on in a few minutes. The focus the Montana program is on the interstate highway system and in underserved communities. So Montana's slice of the pie is about $43 million over the course of 5 years, fiscal year 2022 to 2026, To date, FHWA has appropriated funding for years 2022 through 2024, which is about 24.6 million. These funds are available until they are expended, and the 25 and 26 allocations are contingent upon FHWA's approval of the annual updates to the Montana NEVI plan.
Great, thanks, Ben. Next up is Neil Ullman. He's an energy resource professional in the energy planning section here at the Energy Bureau in DEQ. Go ahead, Neil.
Thanks, Ben. So we've referred a couple of times to the alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. So even before the NEVI plan became law through the bipartisan infrastructure law, FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, had invited states to designate certain highways as alternative fuel corridors, and MDT and DEQ in partnership had recommended to FHWA designating the entire lengths of the 5 highways that you see here. So the entire lengths of I-15, I-90, I-94, US 2, and US 93. And the way that the bipartisan infrastructure law was put together is that those funds for NEVI formula program can only be spent along these AFCs. So that's what we've designated so far and where we're going to be focusing on the next couple of years. Next slide. So for each of those locations along AFCs that are funded in part by NEVI formula funds, there are going to be certain requirements that the Federal Highway Administration, as well as the bipartisan infrastructure law, required. I already mentioned the locations. Specifically along those locations, they need to be within 1 travel mile of the AFC. Basically, that means that you need to, from the end of the interstate exit, for example, it needs to be within 1 travel mile of that exit. So not necessarily from where you get off the off ramp or any particular point of the AFC, is from the end of the exit ramp. Along Highway 2 and Highway 93, as we all know, oftentimes you're driving through the heart of town on one of those. So in all likelihood, it'll be pretty easy to get within 1 travel mile of 2 or 93. The stations eventually need to be all located no further than 50 miles apart in order for each of the alternative fuel corridors to be designated as corridor ready. It'll take a while for us to get to that point, obviously, because through our first round of funding, where we fund certain locations with NEVI funds, we're not going to do all the places in all of Montana along all the AFCs at once. This will be a gradual process, and eventually we'll get closer and closer to having NEVI funded locations, NEVI eligible and compliant locations within 50 miles of each other. This will be a gradual process. And again, also these need to be publicly available 24/7. The stations the chargers themselves need to provide at least 150 kilowatts of power to a single vehicle. Now, that charging experience is going to differ depending on the type of EV that you have and you plug in. Some vehicles can't accept up to 150 kilowatts of charge. Some can accept way more, but the NEVI chargers need to be able to accept, or need to be able to provide at least 150 kilowatts of charge. There needs to be at least 4 of these charging ports at each location that can each provide 150 kilowatts simultaneously to 4 vehicles. So basically that means that a single NEVI compliant location needs to have at least 600 kilowatts of electricity underneath it in order to provide that much charge to 4 electric vehicles. Each plug needs to have the CCS connector. We'll get into that in a minute, but basically the CCS connector is what works on pretty much every non-Tesla electric vehicle. So it'll work right now on Ford, Chevys, Volkswagens, BMWs, and everything else. So that's what for eligible costs, again, we'll get into this in a few minutes, what the FHWA requires. The operation of each of these NEVI locations needs to include that each location needs to have at least a 97% or greater annual uptime. So that basically means that an EV driver needs to have near 100% assurance that when they pull into a NEVI funded charging location, that it's going to work. There's certain reporting requirements that will come along with that we'll also get into a minute to make sure that each charging location complies with that 97% uptime. And each of these NEVI-funded locations needs to be maintained and operated at the same location for at least 5 years. So if we put one in a certain community, we need to know that it's going to be there for at least 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, the federal requirements, are over. So somebody could potentially rip that out of the ground if they wanted to. Hopefully they won't, but we need to have a long-term, at least 5-year assurance that we'll have this statewide network of NEVI chargers.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Back over to Ben Murphy.
Thanks. So we're going to touch on some of the guidance and standards that have been developed for this program. There is the annual deployment plan, which we are working on right now. And this is a requirement that states must submit a updated deployment plan by August 1st. But this year, the deadline has been pushed back to September 1st. And as Neil was just speaking on, the eligible projects and activities, these are posted in the final minimum standards, which is linked at the bottom of the slide that outlines all of the eligible costs, eligible uses of the NEVI formula funds. There is an EVITP certification, and this means that all electricians installing, operating, and maintaining EV chargers must have an EVITP certificate, which can also be done online. You are allowed to receive a continuing ed certificate from a registered apprenticeship as well. And there will be, as Neil mentioned, data collection on all of these NEVI chargers, quarterly and annual. The quarterly data will look something like charging session start times, the energy that is dispensed, the peak session power for each session, as well as the payment methods used for that charging session. And the annual data that will be collected is the maintenance and repair costs on an annual basis for each charging station. There are requirements for Justice 40 in the NEVI program, and the Justice 40 is a federally executive order that requires 40% of the benefits of any federally funded project to flow to disadvantaged communities. There is a map of the Justice 40 communities that is available on the Joint Office website, which I believe we will have linked later on. And Montana does have disadvantaged communities in 21 different counties, and that also includes all 7 tribal reservations. And the Build America, Buy America standards is also a federal executive order. And essentially what this means at this stage in the game is that all EV stations will need to be made in the United States.
So this NEVI plan that we keep talking about, the NEVI deployment plan, was initially a requirement by the Federal Highway Administration that we needed to do in order to start any NEVI project activities. So this is our second annual update. In starting this process, MDT and DEQ signed a memorandum of agreement back in April of 2022 to establish a partnership between the 2 state departments on how we were going to divvy up NEVI work. DEQ is taking the lead on these annual updates that you're participating in today and can comment on up until August 23rd. We're also more than welcome, or we're welcoming one-on-one calls, meetings, emails by August 23rd. If you have follow-up questions, ideas, or thoughts about what Montana's NEVI plan should look like, so feel free to reach out to us after you've had a chance to watch this webinar and review it if you want to on our website, on DEQ's website. The vision and goals of our plan include a host of different things that are mostly required by the Federal Highway Administration. Right now, we're prioritizing locations along the interstates, and we'll eventually branch out to the rest of the other alternative fuel corridors as we get more and more requests for proposals out there to fund NEVI locations. We're making sure that these NEVI locations are complementary and not supplanting private investments. So for example, in Montana, we have a number of charging locations that essentially, in terms of charging speed, number of plugs, things of that nature, their closeness to the interstates do meet NEVI requirements. And we're not going to duplicate those private investments. We want to build upon the network of EV charging, fast charging that we have in the state right now. Again, and so that means filling the charging infrastructure gaps. Right now, for example, one big gap you could point to would be between Glendive and Miles City, where two of those privately funded chargers exist, but there's no charging in between. So closing a gap like that would make a lot of sense, and connecting rural communities across the state to make sure that folks can get from where they live to where they're going and back again safely and without fear of range anxiety, which is a real thing among us EV drivers. And again, going to the 97% uptime, that these are reliable and also affordable operation of charging infrastructure. So right now, the map that we're looking at to start from with NEVI funds looks like this. This is the existing CCS charging locations. And again, CCS, the combined charging system is what it stands for, is the plug that works on any non-Tesla right now, except for the Nissan Leaf. And right now, it's actually better than it was when we had this webinar update a year ago. There's now new chargers that are being maintained and operated and hosted by Electrify America in Glendive and Miles City. I believe the Bozeman one is also fairly new since the webinar, and also a couple of other locations that were put in privately by car dealerships, other businesses across the state. You can see that most of our population areas, the larger population areas anyway, have a number of different options for fast charging. The most notable gaps would be Helena and Great Falls. Right now, Electrify America has installed a fast charging location in Helena at Target. It's not online yet. It should be, I would guess, any time now, but from the looks of it, it's all completely constructed and installed. There is nothing, as far as I know, coming up in the Great Falls area. And then, of course, in terms of statewide charging network, we have a little gap that we call North Central and Northeastern Montana. And, dealing with that will be a major undertaking of this NEVI funding. But this is kind of where we're at right now. Some of these charging locations were funded in part by DEQ's portion of the National Volkswagen Diesel Emissions Settlement. And I can get into more detail on that offline if you have questions about that. But all of this data was pulled from the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuels Data Center.
Okay, I'm going to touch on how we are going to solicit these NEVI stations. The solicitation will be going through alternative contracting at MDT and will be for teams that include design firms, general contractors, site hosts, owner-operators, or any combo of these. It will be a two-phased approach, with the first phase being a request for qualifications. The proposing teams will respond with a statement of qualifications, and these responses will be scored. This will result in a short list of qualified teams, and that'll take us to the second phase, which is the RFP. The shortlisted teams will receive an RFP from MDT. They will respond with a technical proposal and a price proposal. These proposals are scored with the best value method, which are based upon the technical proposal and the price proposal. Upon selection, MDT will issue a notice to proceed, to the successful team, which will then complete the design and construction of all of the sites, or of the sites selected for solicitation. The timeline for the first solicitation is fall of 2024, which is subject to change, of course. And the solicitation process is estimated to be about 8 months from advertisement to award. And the solicitation will be posted on MDT's alternative contracting website, as well as the MDT NEVI website. And next slide, please. And one way to form these teams is through the NEVI partnering website, which is a web page for interested parties to facilitate the partnerships for EV charging infrastructure projects. The results are posted currently on MDT's website, and they are updated weekly depending on new submissions. By submitting, and just a disclaimer, by submitting information to this form, we do agree to have your contact information and facility information posted publicly on MDT and DEQ's NEVI website, and to allow other interested entities to contact you directly.
Neil, I think we're back over to you.
Yep. So these are some resources when we post this slide deck in a PDF form to our website. You'll be able to click on these hyperlinks, but I can also drop them into the Q&A section here in a few moments. The DEQ's Alternative Fuels and Transportation website is where on the DEQ side we'll post. We've already posted the previous update to the NEVI deployment plan, previous recordings of these types of webinars. We'll post the recording of this webinar along with the slide deck. We'll post the 2024 updated NEVI plan once it's approved by the Federal Highway Administration. And we also post on the other clean vehicle and transportation work that we do through Volkswagen and other funding opportunities. Ben at MDT just mentioned the MDT NEVI website. Through there, you can sign up their project partnering list, where if you're an interested site host, EV charging network, EV charging manufacturer, electric utility, or whatever, if you have some sort of interest in being a partner on a NEVI funded location, I would encourage you to look up MDT's NEVI site there. And then also with the DEQ website, we have a link to our Montana Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Prioritization Study, which through a happy coincidence, we had already commissioned when the bipartisan infrastructure law passed. So we had already done a study of where in Montana it made the most sense to prioritize the locations of DC fast chargers for electric vehicles, what kind of effect that would have in Montana, both to drivers as well as the electrical grid, and a whole host of other things that we looked at that has really been the backbone of our NEVI work as well. And then, of course, there's the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which was created by the bipartisan infrastructure law for the U.S. Departments of Energy and Transportation to create a combined joint office to provide information on how this and other federal funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act are working. So driveelectric.gov is the website for the joint office, which has a host of valuable resources for technical assistance, learning about what other states are doing, as well as their lessons learned, and a lot of other really useful tools.
Great, thank you, Neil. And that does bring us to the end of our presentation. So we're going to switch modes here into Q&A and public comments. I'll go ahead and facilitate this round of the webinar. As I noted earlier, you're automatically muted at this time, and you're going to remain muted unless you're called on to speak. If you'd like to ask a question or provide a comment verbally, please use the raise your hand button to get our attention. We are also going to be reading and responding to the questions posted in the Q&A box. As you can see, there are 7 questions there at this point, and we'll work our way through those questions and then go ahead and call on folks who might like to provide a comment or ask a question verbally. If you're on the phone, I don't think we've got anyone on the phone, but just to be sure, if you're on the phone, you will need to press *9 to raise your hand, and then when called on, press *6 to unmute yourself. In addition to this opportunity now to provide comments and feedback for the NEVI plan, feel free to send comments by email to the email address posted that you can see there. And to reiterate Neil's earlier offer, we are certainly available for more detailed follow-ups if folks have individual questions. You feel free to reach out to Ben Murphy at MDT or Neil Ullman at DEQ. With that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A lineup and call on Neil and Ben to address these as appropriate. First question from Nick Schrager: are any or all Tesla superchargers currently available to CCS system vehicles in Montana at this time? Neil, you want to take that one?
Sure. So you've heard me say a couple of times, non-Tesla vehicles. Nick is asking about the Tesla superchargers that are deployed across the state, have been for several years now. The main update that's been happening since we last did this webinar last July is that Tesla has opened up portions of its Tesla supercharger network to be used by non-Tesla vehicles. And they're doing that through a couple of different ways. One is that some new charging locations, some new supercharging locations are being installed with what a lot of people are referring to as the magic dock, where basically you pull in, and if you're not a non-Tesla vehicle, you get onto the Tesla app, you activate that charging stall, and you're able to unlock a built-in adapter that allows you to plug the Tesla charger using the adapter into your CCS port on your non-Tesla vehicle. There are currently none of those magic docks in Montana or any of the surrounding states for that matter. I have used one in Oregon before, and they're pretty easy to use. The other big development is that most of the major auto manufacturers have announced that starting, I believe, in model year 2025, they're going to start building their non-Tesla vehicles with the Tesla-shaped charging port. Now, that's not happening yet, but for those manufacturers that have made that announcement, some have gotten access already to the Tesla supercharging network and have been able to order adapters they keep in their cars and are able to use on certain Tesla superchargers. In Montana, we have 19 Tesla superchargers spread across the state. Of those, because of the newness, I guess, or the technology of when they were installed, 10 of those can be used with an adapter. So if you're a Ford or a Rivian driver, those are right now the only two manufacturers that have access to these adapters right now. If you're a Ford or Rivian driver that have an adapter in your car, you can plug into 10 of those 19 superchargers. There are 9 that are what are referred to as V2 that you cannot use right now, even if you have an adapter. So those superchargers would have to be upgraded by Tesla at some point in time in order to be able to use those adapters. So that's kind of the state of where things are right now on the superchargers neck.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Next question is from Claire. Will standalone medium and heavy duty infrastructure projects be eligible for funding, or is this strictly for light duty vehicle projects? Ben, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll give it a crack. I would say that this program is mostly focused on light duty vehicle charging. While it is not out of the equation, MDT is developing the scoring criteria as we speak. So we haven't made a decision yet either way yet, but I would just say that the emphasis is on light duty vehicle charging at this point.
Thanks, Ben. Next question from an anonymous attendee. Can a 4-port site have less than 600 kilowatts of grid connection if a battery energy storage system is being used for the sole purpose of supporting the direct current fast chargers? Neil, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Unfortunately, the short answer is no, anonymous attendee. The Federal Highway Administration has made it clear that you need to, with 97% certainty, be able to pull in and have access to 150 kilowatts of charging speed whenever you get to a NEVI location. There is a possible maybe scenario where the battery that's associated with those charging ports that you're talking about may be drawn down so far that it can no longer provide the minimum 150 kilowatt charging speed that the feds require. So because there's that maybe possible scenario where that could happen if enough EVs in a short enough period of time use that charging location, draw down that battery, that that wouldn't be an option for NEVI funds, unfortunately. It could be for other federal pots of money where level 2 charging is allowed, and you could make the argument probably to be able to put in something like that, but under the NEVI formula program is not.
Thanks, Neil. I would add that it might also be in the business interest of the owner operator to install battery storage to reduce their utility demand charges. But that is somewhat of a separate consideration. Next up, follow up on the earlier discussion about Tesla or NACS connectors. Are NACS connector requirements under consideration given recent adoption of that standard by most manufacturers? Ben, do you want to speak to that question on the specifications of these chargers and whether NACS connectors will be considered?
Sure. Similar to the question I just recently answered, is that we are developing the scoring criteria, And we are definitely interested in allowing for NACS to be an eligible cost. We think that with the way the industry is going, it would be lacking foresight to not include NACS connectors at our NEVI stations. So they're definitely under consideration, but I cannot definitively say yes or no at this point.
Right now, they are not an eligible cost. If an entity were to come to MDT to request funding and they wanted to get funding assistance that would include NACS Tesla-shaped plugs, the answer would be no. Since the last webinar that we had a year ago, Federal Highway Administration did put out a request for information asking anybody interested in responding, mostly industry, but also the general public, if they thought that the Federal Highway Administration should make the NACS plug, the Tesla plug, eligible for NEVI reimbursement. So far as I know, and I've asked several times, the FHWA has not released the findings of their RFI, nor have they started the process to change the project eligibility requirements of the NEVI formula program. So right now, for any state, but I think actually some states have included the Tesla plug, but that ends up being at the sole cost of whoever it is that's going to be installing, owning, operating, paying for the minimum 20% cost share of it. So right now it's not a NEVI eligible cost, but as we said in our webinar last year, either the NACS plug, the Tesla plug, or the CHAdeMO plug, which works on the Nissan Leaf, and the Nissan Leaf is still being manufactured in Tennessee. Those could be installed at a NEVI funded location. They just could not receive any NEVI funding to help with that installation cost.
Thank you, Ben and Neil. We are well aware that this is a fast-changing landscape, and at the end of the day, it's going to be those criteria that MDT releases in the RFP that will call the shots in terms of this first round of funding for Montana NEVI funded station. So stay tuned on the specifics there. Next up is a question. There's a handful of questions we received related to announced charging locations at Town Pump. Also, a previous award actually issued by DEQ for charging stations that Northwestern Energy was planning to build and operate. And I'm going to go ahead and lump a couple of these together. One from Karin. I heard on the news that Northwestern Energy had planned to build chargers, but they pulled out. Same for Town Pump. Were these going to be NEVI chargers? What happened? What were the reasons to pull out of those plans? Neil is our manager of the Volkswagen settlement funding that was behind these projects, and going to turn it over to him to address these questions.
Thanks, Karin, and others who asked this question. So as Ben said, these were DEQ funded projects that were funded in part by the Volkswagen diesel emissions settlement. So to your question, part of your question, Karin, these were not going to be NEVI chargers. Some of the funding, one of the awards was made directly to Northwestern Energy that would have located charging infrastructure at Town Pumps within their service territory. We also made another award to Town Pump directly that would have been at Town Pump locations in other electric service territories. Ultimately, both of those projects ended up not moving forward, and each of the grantees requested the contracts be terminated. I don't know the specific reasons. You would want to reach out to them. There was a recent Montana Public Radio article where I said the same, that we decided to not move forward together on the project. None of the funds were spent on either of those projects, so DEQ does still have all of the Volkswagen funding that were awarded to each of those projects, and we're still in the process of evaluating how to move forward with the limited Volkswagen funds that we have spent. So far with the Volkswagen funds, we've funded a total of 6 DC fast charger locations scattered across the state. The locations are all online and operational right now. They are currently in Libby, Kalispell, Gardner, Bozeman, Sealy Lake, and Y, just outside of Missoula and Polson. So we have done some work with those funds, and we look to do more in the future as we evaluate how to move forward.
Thank you, Neil. Next up, a question for you, Ben. Will the teams be responsible for the 20% match funding?
Short answer is yes. The 20% match must come from the applicant or the private entity who is applying for the funds. The 80% will be come from the federal dollar, but yes, the private sector will need to cover the 20% match.
Thanks, Ben. And a question perhaps for both Neil and Ben to tag team. Can you provide an update on the implementation progress of the 2023 NEVI deployment plan? We certainly mentioned some of the updates in the presentations, but Ben, do you want to take a first stab at this? Do you want to flag the specific updates or progress on the development of the NEVI program in the last year?
Sure. Yeah, I would say the big note is that we are working with a consultant and developing our draft contract language for the NEVI contracts. We do have a draft contract that we are working through. So that is new within the last year, and shortly following after or alongside is the development of the RFQ and RFP. So those have not gone out yet, but they are being developed within the DEQ, MDT, and consultant team. So we are making progress on that. It's slow, but it's steady. So we are really looking forward to the fall. We think we will be having a solicitation out in the fall.
Thanks, Ben. And I guess the other, key change since the 23 deployment plan is the changing map of existing charging stations. Neil, anything that you want to supplement on that end?
No, you can get on to either the U.S. Department of Energy's Alternative Fuel Data Center, or one location that EV drivers use is plugshare.com. And you can do filters of all kinds of ways just to see what the status is of existing chargers. PlugShare does planned chargers, coming soon chargers. So you can get a sense there. Again, we're not trying to duplicate private investments, though. So when we know that locations like Glendive, Miles City, and Helena from Electrify America are coming online in the very near future, we definitely take that into consideration, and we're continuously monitoring for other updates on other locations that could provide the same NEVI type charging experience that we're looking to do through the Montana program.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Thanks, Ben. Next question from McKenna. Beyond geographic location priorities, which types of organizations make the best site partners? This could include findings from Montana or other states' experiences with NEVI thus far. Ben, do you want to kick this one off? Again, referring to your partnering website and specifically the kinds of partners that will be entertained in that RFQ. And then Neil, I think you might have some additional insights in terms of how these things have worked well in other states.
Yeah, I'll let Neil take the bulk of this question, but I guess I'll just mention that in other states, we're seeing them go in mostly at gas stations or convenience stores. And from the DOT's perspective, the best project partners are likely going to be ones that have had experience with Title 23 funds, which are transportation funds. And as mentioned at the start of the webinar from Rob, there are many strings attached to these funds. So working with entities who are aware of what some of those strings are and are able to successfully navigate those strings is going to be really beneficial. And I think I'll leave it at that, Neil. I'll let you chime in.
Yeah, that's definitely a good flag in terms of who the owner and operator is going to ultimately be of the chargers. I keep mentioning these Electrify America chargers in Glendive and Miles City. They're at existing travel plazas. So I think one is a Flying J and the other one's a Town Pump in each of those communities that was obviously already there. And they just simply had enough space to be able to develop whatever partnership they did with Electrify America to use a corner of their travel plaza area to host those Electrify America chargers. If you look at other NEVI locations that are online and operational in other parts of the country, it is a pretty diverse. There is a lot of, as Ben Murphy alluded to, a lot of convenience store travel plaza locations. The first ones to go online in the country was, I believe, at a Flying J in Ohio, but also the first one to go online in New York was at a Bank of America. There's the first one to go online in Hawaii was at a Kiss and Ride multimodal hub, where they just had an existing parking lot and they put in chargers there. One of the ones that's been awarded in Tennessee is going in at a Waffle House. So it's a pretty diverse group of locations across the country. One of the main things, though, that you need to take into consideration is how much space and what type of space that you have available, as well as how easy is to access the electricity that you need in order to do it. Through the NEVI the EV prioritization study that I referenced that we had already commissioned, we were very concerned for some rural locations. The example that I like to use is Craig, which is halfway between Helena and Great Falls. With a small town like Craig, which is more or less shut down for the winter, and then opens up in force during the summer for folks who want to hit the river, could a small community like that host a NEVI-funded charger? The answer ended up being yes, surprisingly to us, because of its proximity to I-15. It actually has access to the energy that it needs. So that was an exciting development for us. And there's a lot of other locations like that. There are other locations, though, that will have a little bit more trouble getting access to energy, and we'll just have to figure that out as we go along. But space is certainly another issue in addition to experience that Ben mentioned.
Great, thanks, Neil. Ben, anything else to chime in on that front? Okay. Circling back on the Volkswagen funded projects, and a related question. Previously, there was a fast charging station planned and posted on maps for Hamilton at a town pump there. No longer appears on those maps on PlugShare. Are there plans for any charging stations in the Bitterroot?
So hopefully, anonymous attendee, you heard my previous answer about how that project unfortunately is not moving forward. I'm not aware, other than the Electrify America location here in Helena that's in the process of coming online, I'm not aware of any fast charging locations in development solely done by private entities. Now, the Bitterroot, of course, is along Highway 93, one of our designated alternative fuel corridors. So it is definitely on the map for potential for NEVI funded chargers. And we'll be rolling out this funding in waves through a series of RFPs. So look for more news on when NEVI RFP might be coming to the Bitterroot sometime in the near future, hopefully.
Great, thanks, Neil. Somewhat of a related question from an anonymous attendee. How are you balancing the need to support charging for non-Montanans? For example, traveling through Montana, visiting national parks versus Montana population centers versus gaps in the network, even where EV deployment is extremely low. Ben, do you want to take a first crack in terms of prioritization and how that might look in the NEVI rollout? And we can go to Kyla and Neil.
Sure, I'll come, or go ahead, Kyla.
Oh, no,
I would say that we're balancing it based on, as Neil had mentioned previously, the EV prioritization study. It has laid out where stations in Montana will need to be to meet the 50-mile gap. And unfortunately, fortunately, they're all along alternative fuel corridors, which don't get necessarily close to the national parks or some of the highest tourist areas in Montana. But I think that we're trying to look at the bigger picture and how we want to build out this eventual network. And how we get there, it might vary from year to year, but we're trying to get the 50-mile gaps filled along all alternative fuel corridors. And I'll pass it over to Neil.
Yeah, I would just probably add to that. I think Ben covered most of the answer to that question. We did kind of an analysis of looking at kind of a park to park, so between Glacier National Park and Yellowstone National Park corridor, which is why we have also included US 93 and US Highway 2, of course, for Glacier in our alternative fuel corridor designations, and those are priorities. We know that visitors to Montana frequent both national parks, and it's one of the number 2 reasons that people visit Montana in the summer. So as Ben said, we're kind of balancing all of those travel habits and interests in evaluating, where to prioritize locations and working with MDT as they roll out RFPs for the charging locations.
Great, thanks, Ben. Kyla, we're going to jump to a question on the RFQ and RFP process next. I just want to be sure we get this one in. For Ben, can you please elaborate on the RFQ, RFP process? Has the RFQ already been administered or selections made? Is there a time frame for these to be announced on the street? Does MDT DEQ intend to award only a single contract for all sites across the state, or will multiple contracts be awarded? And Ben, as part of this question, if you could address the various funding tranches that MDT is anticipating, I think that would be helpful additional context.
Sure, and I might call on Sheila or Clancy as well to help me answer this question. But I think just to get the ball rolling a little bit, we have not administered an RFQ or an RFP yet. That is what we are working on currently. And as I said, we hope to have that out in the fall. As far as what we intend to award, we are hoping to award a contract for a bundle of sites. So applicants will be bidding on multiple locations. And if they were awarded that contract, they would be responsible for building and designing and constructing all contracts or all locations in that bundle. And in terms of the funding, Ben, do you mean what the next 2 tranches are after the plan update?
Yep, exactly.
Yep, I believe it's about $9 million. Neil, correct me if I'm wrong. I think we're expecting about $9 million in the next 2 years to get to that full $43 million that we were eligible for. Sheila or Clancy, I know Clancy's on the line. Do you have any further comments on the RFQ, RFP process?
This is Sheila. So the first project bundle is targeting 5 to 7 million, which does target pretty much our first apportionment from the federal government. And then we will apply any lessons learned from that and continue prioritizing bundled projects until the funds are spent. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila and Ben. Clancy, if there's anything to add from your team at MDT, feel free to raise your hand via Zoom. We'll get you unmuted and you can jump in. Stand by. Clancy, if you unmute yourself, you should be good to go.
Yeah, hi, this is Clancy Williams with MDT Alternative Contracting Section. And so the SOQ and RFP process will be that MDT will advertise by releasing the request for qualifications, and then teams will respond to that request with their statements of qualifications. That's generally a 1-month process in total. And then once we receive those statements of qualifications, we would score and shortlist down to 3 firms. And then those 3 firms would provide to us a technical proposal, and then we would go through another round of scoring. And then at the end of the scoring, we would then receive the bid price proposals. And the best value selection is a combination of the technical proposal score and the bid price proposal score, calculated as the best value. And that firm with the highest best value score would then be selected and recommended for award. And I think, as Ben already mentioned, about an 8-month process, all said and done.
Great, thanks, Clancy. Hold tight for 1 second there, if you would. We've got one more question related to the procurement process that might be a good one for you if Ben or Sheila need a hand here. Question is, will electric vehicle service equipment providers be able to apply for sites on behalf of site hosts and or future station owners? Ben or Clancy, one of you want to take that one?
Sure, I can go ahead. What we're looking for is a full team to provide a plug and play station. And so the partnering list that we have posted online is a great venue for people to be able to form teams or operate their services to, say, a team that they see may be missing what it is they have to offer. I'll let Ben and Sheila add on if they.
Yeah, I would just add that at this point we are leaning to, anybody can apply, but if you are not the site host, you will have to have a site host agreement. We just need assurance that you can put this EV charging equipment where you say you want to. So as long as you got a team and you got all of the parts in place, anybody can apply.
Great. And one more question for you two, Ben and Clancy. Could you tell us, please, who the consultant is that you're working with on the NEVI program?
Yeah,
Clancy, I'll defer to you.
Yep, we're working with the alternative contracting term consultant, which is a team of DJ&A, Dowell, and Garver.
Thank you, Clancy. Let's see, we've got one question or one hand raised. Ted Dukart, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. And then Ted, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and provide your comment or question when you're ready. And Ted, it does look like you're still muted. You'll have to unmute yourself on your end. Ted, we're still not hearing you. If you're there and can unmute yourself, then go ahead and provide your comment or question. We'll go ahead and circle back to you, Ted. Feel free to raise your hand again, and we'll get you next time around if you still have a question or a comment. Let's see, we've got one. Oh, I saw your note there. One more question. Has MDT or DEQ considered the placement of chargers installed under the Fast Charge Your Ride Volkswagen program, and have those projects been installed yet? I know we've touched on Fast Charge Your Ride and the Volkswagen funding in some detail, but Neil, do you want to follow up on that question?
Sure. Anonymous attendee, when I was talking about the Northwestern Town Pump projects that ended up being terminated, those Fast Charge Your Ride is the project I was talking about. So those chargers are no longer moving forward. However, a number of other fast chargers that I mentioned earlier did move forward and are online and operational. All the ones that we funded through both our Charge Your Ride and Fast Charge Your Ride project for DC fast charging are online and operational. We are considering them, I think, a little bit in terms of where they're at on the alternative fuel corridors. So the ones that I've mentioned already that are located on AFCs are Libby, Kalispell, Y, Bozeman, Polson. I guess the only one, then the other two, Seeley Lake and Gardner, are not along designated alternative fuel corridors. So for the purposes of the NEVI plan, the 4 that are on AFCs, we do look at that. Each of those communities, especially Kalispell, Missoula area, Bozeman, all have multiple fast charging options for non-Teslas. They also have, except for Kalispell, have Tesla superchargers. So there are multiple locations. Not all of them would necessarily be considered NEVI eligible in terms of the charging speed. If you look at the Kalispell area, for example, they don't have any 150 kilowatt chargers or above, but there are plenty of other chargers that do provide fast speeds of charging. So we are taking that a little bit into the consideration. The ultimate goal of the NEVI plan, as passed by Congress, signed by the president, and all the requirements of the Federal Highway Administration, is that even for those chargers or locations like Kalispell that don't have NEVI chargers but do have multiple charging locations, is that we bring NEVI speed charging and reliability to those communities. So as we gradually roll out, we still have to put the first RFQ and RFP out into the field. But as we develop this project, and as Sheila and Ben have both mentioned, these funds are available until spent, so there's not an expiration date on them. But hopefully, as we get towards the end, we'll have built out a pretty solid statewide network of chargers that are both NEVI compliant, providing NEVI compliant speeds, but also other chargers that maybe individual private businesses decided to invest in themselves.
Great. Thanks, Neil. Just a quick time check. We are coming up on 3:30, which we had anticipated might be the end of the webinar, but we are willing to hang tight and run this over time. If there are additional questions, I do see one hand raised, and we'll go to Nick Schrauger here shortly. Again, if you do have any further questions that you want answered by this team live, please drop them into the Q&A box. And again, questions or comments are welcome at the mtenergy@mt.gov email address, or directly to Ben Murphy or Neil Ullman. Their contact information is still posted on the slide. So Nick, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to talk. You go ahead, unmute yourself and provide your comment or question. Nick, we're not hearing you. You're going to need an unmute on your end in order to ask your question.
Hello.
Yep, we can hear you now. Go ahead, Nick.
I inadvertently raised my hand. I'm sorry, I didn't have anything to say. As Neil probably knows, I could probably talk for a while and say or mean nothing, but I just say thank you very much for all your work on this, and someday we'll get there and this will all be convenient. Right now, as electric car drivers, we know that it's not the most convenient, and those of us who are not faint-hearted are willing to go out and go for it as this thing develops, but it has challenges. But we appreciate your work and thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Appreciate the comment. All right, with that, last call for any questions or comments. You're a timely bunch. Looks like we're going to wrap up right on 3:30. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. As Neil responded to one question, we will go ahead and make these slides available on our DEQ Alternative Fuels program page sometime after the second webinar, which is tomorrow, Tuesday at 6 p.m. And if you care to register for that webinar as well, the link is available again on the DEQ Energy Alternative Fuels and Transportation Program page. And with that, thanks again for joining us, and we're going to call it a day.
Thank you.